In 1960, Nestor Savchuk was born in the province of Crimea in southern Russia. He was never close to his family, but was always distant from them. As he grew into a young man, he began to channel all his energy into wrestling, boxing, and the martial arts. He possessed a keen awareness and stood out above his peers. Nestor also had an artistic side, being a talented painter. In his early 20s, he traveled to Odessa to work as an apprentice painting religious murals. In Odessa, he became friends with the older artists, who began to inspire him with stories of righteous men and women who had glorified God through their courageous labors in the monasteries of Russia over the last 1,000 years. It was the early 1980s. Russia was communist, and the ancient Orthodox Christian faith had been all but forgotten by the Russian people. Suddenly, a spark was kindled in Nestor's heart. He began to burn with a desire to flee the vanity of the world and tap into his ancient Christian roots. Making the resolve to give his life wholly to God, Nestor left Odessa for the ancient 13th century Pochayev monastery. Here, Nestor began laboring in dedication of heart as a monk. As Providence would have it, Nestor discovered that he had two long-lost great-uncles who served at the monastery. One was a married priest who lived with his family in the town, and the other was a greatly revered old monk who had been known for his righteous life. At that time, the monasteries in communist Russia were regulated by the government. All the monks were required to be registered with the state, which was atheist. Nestor, being against atheism, never registered. In the mid-1980s, the government began to persecute the monastery. Some monks were taken to prison camps, while others simply disappeared. Because he was not registered with the state, Nestor knew he would be put in prison or killed if he were found by the government officials. And so Nestor continued on struggling in the warlike conditions, living in hiding as an illegal monk. Nestor, having a strong and brave soul, was soon ordained a priest-monk at an extremely young age. Eventually, the conditions at Pochayev Monastery became so severe that most of the monks had either left, been taken away to prison camps, or killed. Not knowing what to do, Nestor turned to his spiritual father, the elder John Christiankin, who told him to go to the isolated village of Jaki. Following his advice as divine guidance, Nestor headed out across the great expanse of Russia's countryside. After a long journey, Nestor arrived in the little village of Jaki. Because it was surrounded by vast wilderness and the roads were flooded in winter, Jaki was accessible only during the summer months. Few believers remained in the village. Upon arriving at this desolate village in the Russian wilderness, Nestor went straight to the church where he would be serving. It was old and run down, but had many ancient icons. Nestor's original inspiration had come from religious images, and latter, he died for these ancient images, icons of Christ and the saints. Ever since he became a monk, his heart burned for Christ and the other world they represented. Nestor looked at icons and images of Christ in a unique way. He didn't see wood and paint, but rather his heart was transformed, and he felt the eternal kingdom of God within himself. To understand the image, icon of Christ, is to understand the incarnation of God. At one time, 2 righteous fools for Christ's sake had been martyred at this church. Before they were murdered, they prophesied, saying that the priest who shall serve here until the end will be saved. Not aware of the prophecy, but sensing a mystical air about the old church, Nestor immediately said that he loved the place with all his heart and wanted to stay there the rest of his life. As is the lot of those who pursue righteousness, Suffering awaited Nestor. The police warned him of an icon-stealing ring run by the Russian Mafia. Gangsters from Odessa who would steal icons from rural churches and sell them on the black market for big money. Nearly all the churches in the area had been burglarized. Other difficulties came from local hooligans who hassled him because he was a priest. One day, Nestor tucked in his long hair and beard, as was his custom when traveling, so as to keep a low profile, and headed out for the bus stop with some important documents. At the bus stop, 3 drunken youths approached him and began to harass him. "Show me your cross," they taunted him, and began grabbing under his jacket to get at his cross. So as not to allow them to defile his cross, Nestor was forced to deflect their hands. Not knowing that Nestor was skilled in martial arts, the youths tried to attack him. But he dodged their punches, making the fight look more like a dance. Suddenly, remembering that his documents were unguarded, Nestor hesitated. At that moment, he was hit by a blow in the eye. Soon the police arrived, but Nestor told them to let the youths go. He hadn't forgotten that he too had once been a rebellious youth. A month later, the youth who had punched Nestor in the eye came to his house to say he was sorry. After talking to him for a while, the young Andrew decided to join forces with him, moved into his house, and began to follow his strict way of life. With his youthful zeal, he had brought life to the desolate village of Jaki. Nestor also travelled to several other churches in the surrounding region, helping all in need, Christian or non-Christian. To the Russian people, the young Nestor was a reminder of their ancient Christian roots. In addition to his selfless work for others, Nestor maintained an austere life of prayer. After travelling to visit his spiritual children in other villages, Nestor would walk home at night. He didn't like to travel in cars. These late-night walks were the only time he had to himself. Even through the winter snow, he would walk as far as 12 miles to get home. This was his time to be alone with God. He would immerse himself in prayer, losing track of time. Nestor would return home to complete his rigorous prayer rule, which consisted of hours of singing ancient chant and kneeling in prayer with tears. In time, Nestor travelled to the war zone of Abkhazia, Georgia, a small country bordering southern Russia, formerly part of the Soviet Union, in order to help the suffering people and to spread the light and truth of Christ. He began to thrive in the warlike conditions, and the ultimate sacrifice a Christian can give was born in him, the desire to be martyred for faith in Christ. Knowing that death was imminent in the hostile land of Abkhazia, Nestor felt drawn to stay. His spiritual father back in Russia, however, guided him back to the village of Jaki by saying to him, "Would a mother abandon her own children to raise another's children?" Nestor realized that he had to return to his own spiritual children. Upon returning to Russia, Nestor met with more hardship and even persecution. The church was robbed several times, caught fire once, and Nestor even suffered a backlash of envy and strife from his own people. He once told a friend that it was the ones he gave the most to who troubled him the most. In 1993, 3 monks were murdered at the famous Optina monastery in central Russia. In the 19th century, Optina was the spiritual capital of Orthodox Russia, renowned for its lineage of eldership which had come down from St. Paisius Velikovsky. Crowds of people, including the authors Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and others, had flocked to Optina monastery for spiritual guidance from the great elders. The 3 monks were stabbed to death on Easter night during the celebration of Christ's resurrection. The autopsy showed what seemed to be a ritualistic killing. Each had had his throat slit, and the stab wounds were in a specific pattern. A blood-stained dagger was found on the murderer grounds with the numbers 666 inscribed on the blade. Later, a man confessed to the murders and admitted that the killings were a ritual of a satanic cult and that he had deliberately killed the 3 best monks in the monastery. Nestor often spoke of the Optina martyrs with great reverence, and it became evident that he longed to follow them. He longed for a martyr's crown himself. Once a friend tried to counsel him that it was better to be long-suffering and endure the tedious trials of life. To this, Nestor replied, "You know, my friend, I have such a fiery desire to receive a martyr's crown because I led a loose life as a youth and lived only for myself. How can I repay God for what he has given me?" The friend pleaded with him, "It's too daring to desire martyrdom. You must suffer for a long time." Nestor again replied, "Yes, I understand that, but maybe if I will pray for martyrdom, perhaps I will be able to pray it out." Truly, Nestor was now ablaze with that fire of faith that burns for the other world. He saw death not as an end of life, but as a beginning. His faith was deep, to the extent that he had begun to pray for suffering and even death not as an escape from this world, but in order to be mystically crucified with Christ. Again, the church was robbed. This time, Nestor had had enough. His poor church was being extorted. He had to do something. Quickly, he spotted a tire track in the snow leading to a dirt road in the woods and began to follow it. In the distance was a parked car. To conceal the fact that he was a monk, Nestor took off his monk's cap, pulled up his robe, and approached the car staggering and yelling as if he were drunk. Inside the car sat a gangster who immediately jumped out of the car and attacked him. Once again, Nestor's experience in the martial arts came to his aid, as he was able to deflect the gangster's punches and so buy enough time to get the license plate number of the vehicle. The police eventually caught the gangsters and returned the icons to the church. Word came to Nestor that if he pressed charges, the Mafia would hunt him down. His closest friends pleaded with him not to do it. Nestor met with the gangster who had attacked him and asked him why he had done it. The gangster replied, "Money." And Nestor asked him if he regretted stealing from the church. But he answered without a drop of remorse, "I have no regret whatsoever." Nestor knew he had to make a stand. If he let the Mafia intimidate him, his poor church would suffer. To one who tried to talk him out of it, Nestor explained, "If these were my personal enemies, I could forgive them. But these men are enemies of the simple believers and of God. They have no remorse for the evil they have done. I cannot let them go." Then began several attempts on Nestor's life, which he narrowly escaped. The robberies of icons had become widespread. Every church in the region had been burglarized at least once. Nestor began to guard the church at night. The Mafia was not just after the icons anymore. They wanted Nestor's life. On one occasion, Nestor heard a knock at the door. When he opened the door, he was held at gunpoint. Not backing down, Nestor fearlessly looked straight into the eyes of the hoods, turned around, walked into his house, and locked the door. The hoods came after him, breaking in the window. Grabbing a flare gun, Nestor fired some shots to scare them off. But, knowing he was a monk and priest, and so would not shoot them, they barged through the window. Nestor then ran into his room and locked the door, and as he was climbing out of the window, he cut his arm and began to bleed. Quickly, he bandaged his arm and then escaped. As he fled, blood dripped on the ground, the very ground on which he would later shed his life's blood. Knowing that each day could be his last, Nestor began to double his missionary work. A close friend of his recalls, "To each he would give his all. They would flock to him." At times it was difficult. Sometimes he would lock himself in his room for 2 or 3 days to fast and pray. In this way, he received strength to go on. In the last year I knew him, he became so deep, a simple depth that came from trust in God. He was not afraid of anything. He was an unusual man who gave himself to the will of God. He was fearless. Nestor had broken through the wall that separates God and man, and God had become a living force in him. A close friend remembers one of his last conversations with priest-monk Nestor. We talked about the enemies of the church. He said to me, "Why should we be afraid?" I said, "But those wicked thieves are everywhere." He spoke calmly. "To all is God's will. To suffer for Christ, this is a great joy." He talked about the spiritual war going on in the world today. He was already prepared for death. On December 31st, 1993, priest-monk Nestor was found dead outside the window of his house, with his throat slit and with multiple stab wounds. The people believed that it was not a simple case of revenge, but was a strategic move in a spiritual war that is taking place today throughout the world. As the forces of darkness increase, the light becomes more visible. The life and death of priest-monk Nestor do not represent defeat, but the triumph of God's righteousness. It is the height of the human experience, martyrdom for the truth. Hieromonk Nestor passed from this life at the age of 33, the same age at which Jesus Christ was crucified. In a world void of examples of righteousness, these lovers of truth offer a heroic example of suffering for the truth. But their lives mean nothing unless they are embraced by us and unless we imitate them. Clearly, the message of these righteous ones is one that this world is not the least bit interested in. Those who, like these lovers of truth, have felt themselves out of place in society, who have been devoured and spit forth by the uncomprehending world, can understand their radical call of the last true rebellion. The respectable ones do not hear Christ's message that is not of this world, but the outcasts understand.